Hey, Dooberteers, welcome back to the show. My guest today is somebody that I think you're going to enjoy hearing about because, she started out her career, maybe I guess I could call it, Melissa. And I mean, she was tap dancing competitively. She's somebody that's an avid bird watcher now, lots of years in social services, and then made the pivot over to animal welfare. And we're super excited to have her. So, Melissa, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad that you're joining us today. So tell us a little bit about you and tell us about Toronto Humane.
Yes, my journey as someone in animal welfare started not in animal welfare because I think like most children, you grow up and you're like, I love animals. And everyone's like, well, then you're going to be a vet.
Right.
And then you go through school and I'm like, oh, I'm not enjoying math and science. So I guess that's out of the question and you don't really know what else is out there. So I went with what felt good and comfortable in the sort of social service lens. And then it was honestly just a conversation with one of my mom's best friends where I said, like, I am enjoying it, but I think we were just at the Toronto Zoo and I was like, I would just love if I was doing something like this. And then she just sort of like, so why don't you? I was like, well, I don't know because I'd have to go back to school and all this other stuff. And she's like, so just do it. And I was like, okay. And then that next day I was just like researching other jobs and I was like, okay, you can be a tech or you can be a vet assistant or, training and all this other sort of stuff. So I ended up going to college and then got into some exposure of different sort of areas. So whether it was like wildlife or a vet clinic or sheltering, and sheltering sort of became what I loved. And I was like, okay, I didn't know this was a thing, but here we are. And then a few years into it, I started working at Toronto Humane Society as an animal care worker. And it was one of those moments where I'm like, well, I'm just going to do this for my whole life. This is great. This is like the best job. And then I became interested in sort of the training and behavior side, particularly with dogs as they move through the shelter. So then I became a certified trainer and worked with Toronto Humane Society as that. And then just the opportunity came up to sort of move into leadership positions. So that was a tough point for me where it was like, do I leave some of the more hands-on stuff to sort of go more operational? Sometimes I miss it. But then, I've just been grateful to sort of grow within the organization to get to where I am now, which is the director of animal sheltering. So Toronto Humane Society is a nonprofit in the city of Toronto, and we have sort of three main pillars of our organization. So there's sort of the traditional animal sheltering. So that's sort of my purview in terms of, animals coming in, getting care or treatment to whatever sort of like outcome they are. Then we have our community animal welfare. And I think that's sort of been a part of the organization for a long time. But as the sector is making the shift, we are sort of at the forefront of making sure that programming, including public veterinary services, temporary foster, pet food bank, public training, all those sort of like community-based services are really there. And so that my program's still relevant, but like less the response, and we're sort of that safety net now. And then we also have research and integration. So a lot of my colleagues working on things related to behavioral, shelter medicine, social work, and all that sort of stuff. So those are kind of our main pieces as an organization. Mine is just focused on being that safety net, kind of reducing. I think we're all working ourselves at a job where we're sort of like, we don't want to exist in this way, in sort of this traditional model. So how can our programming evolve? How can we as a sector in animal welfare move to sort of understand where people and their pets are today and keep them together?
Yeah, I really love that. I mean, I think as you and I were talking before we hit record here, it seems like animal welfare is morphing, right, over the last few years. I mean, I guess from your perspective, how has it changed? I mean, you've been in this industry now for about 15 years. How has it changed from when you started to today? It seems like we're a lot more community focused.
Absolutely. I think there's definitely been a shift from when I started to now to that focused. So recognizing when I came in, myself personally, but also just sort of like felt like the general sentiment were, yes, animals should come into the shelter because people are not meeting that animal's needs and therefore they shouldn't have the animal. We'll take care of it. And then we'll find it this like new placement.
Right.
And I admit that now to you, Chris, out of just like sheer horror. And I do tell people that often, like I came in here and I was pretty judgmental of how things were, how people were perceived and how people seeking help were, because I think this historical model and way in which not we sort of been established or running didn't recognize that as animals or pets became more integral to part of the family, we didn't really shift our systems to account for that. And that you start to notice the more you're working in the admissions that people don't often, like I'd say 95% or more, don't want to be there. They don't want to be relinquishing their animals. They are experiencing some sort of crisis that is preventing them to sort of maintain that bond. And our model has just been like, okay, yep, so we'll take it and we'll go and do this and find a new family.
Right.
And it's really, I think, just us recognizing what a reactive model that is and trying to think more on the proactive or preventative way. Just if we think about vaccines, right? You want to make sure that your animals are protected. So trying to make sure that our community is set up for success to have what they need to maintain that human-animal bond, and then us just be the default, for those ones that truly, the human-animal bond is broken. If animal relocation is an area that we can look at to sort of support while other communities are trying to build up their systems, or strays. So animals that, are perceived not to have a home. So we're kind of being there for that versus the sort of admissions of animals that have a person. And so looking at, as a community hub, what programming or what needs do we need to be addressing? And for the city of Toronto, a lot of that is around, our focus is around veterinary medicine and access to care. Just noting that it's estimated in the city of Toronto that 400 to 500,000 cats and dogs are living outside of a vet-patient relationship. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to tackle that as sort of the biggest piece. So that access to care, we've been running preventative services in terms of vaccines and wellness and spay neuter and dentals for some time, but now we're trying to expand that scope. And we just earlier this year launched a new clinic with a few more in our, for hopefully in the next decade, a few others across the city to sort of help meet that need as kind of being one of the biggest reasons that people reach out to Toronto Humane Society for surrender is often that, access to care, cost of care, whether it's seeking veterinary care, the cost of emergency care, the amount of referral care that's needed, and or just other economical challenges, just sort of, in the city of Toronto or wherever geographically people are located, there's a rise in just sort of the economical tensions. Yeah. Many people that are deciding, do they put food on the table for themselves or for their pet? And often we find people are doing whatever they can, to keep their animals above themselves. So trying to make sure our programs are reaching them.
So how has your leadership style had to adapt, right? Because I can imagine when the idea is just bring all the animals in the shelter, it's one style, but now it's really much more of a community focus, right? Like you're trying to find a reason to keep the animal out of the shelter in the first place. How does that, as a leader, how do you address that with your team? How do you motivate them and get them to understand that new mission?
I mean, I think it comes through a lot of just conversations and just sort of understanding, and where do we fit in, within our strategic plan as Toronto Humane Society, but then more globally, how is the sector making the shift? How would you find yourself? And I think it does, one of the hardest parts, I think, to accept as a leader is you may not bring everyone along with you. You may have those conversations and you may have those people that just aren't aligned with this sort of model of work that we're trying to go towards. And fundamentally, I can't necessarily change where that person stands or their ethics, but I think just making sure people understand where they fit in to this idea. So like I said, we sort of have those 3 pillars where for the longest time, animal sheltering was the bread and butter, what everyone knew Toronto Humane Society was for. And that was what people were, it's what our donors are invested in. And that's where people come to volunteer and they come to adopt. And that's sort of what we're known for. Obviously, getting everyone to shift and our narratives to shift and our, engagement with the community whether they are clientele actually coming to us or just general community to understand what our sort of like focus and desire is a journey. And I think that having those conversations and making sure people understand, how do I, as a foster coordinator fit in this new idea, right? How do I shift my model to trying to be as efficient without compromising engagement with our foster parents to expand how many are out in the community, and how do the models work that way versus your animal care team who is seeing animals leaving to foster sooner or coming in for shorter periods of time because then maybe reunification becomes an option, or they do that, they sort of, those foster driven ones for the ones that have a longer length of stay for placement, and it's sort of, trying to get them to understand how, it's hard because you work at the shelter because you love it and you're invested. And then to have someone say like, actually, everything we've been doing is not in the best interest of the animals.
Right.
Like, that's hard to take. You're just like every day where you're like staying in the shelter to the best, like as much as we try to make it a good place, like there's no place for an animal to be. That's really hard for a person to be like, I've devoted my whole life and career to this. And now it's just sort of being like, this is bad. Yeah, it's hard to get people to understand those changes. And I think it ultimately comes down to sort of making sure you're investing some time to talk to people, to have them understand the direction, and then letting them decide. And then it's just accepting if they're not aligned or they don't feel comfortable with this, then that's a decision that they have to make. And I think that recognizing you're not going to bring everyone along with you, I think can be hard, especially when you have a good team and you're invested with an individual person where you want them to succeed. But then recognizing, okay, maybe they're going to exceed somewhere else, but unfortunately not with me. And that's just one of the harder parts.
Yeah, it is a hard pivot, like you said. And for people that have been in this industry for longer than you and I, change is hard. And why is this model broken? We've been doing this for decades. And so it is. And as you said, sometimes people are not going to be able to make that journey. I'm curious, Melissa, how has your background in social work helped you to, address this problem and morphing and pivoting that we're making as an industry?
I think I feel lucky to sort of, I always joke that I'm like, oh man, if I knew veterinary social work was a thing, I was like, who knows where I could have ended up. But it's having an understanding of, sort of that intersectionality that's happening, that we can't address our pet problem without addressing the people that are there. So that's sort of like other end of the leash or whatever sort of like coined phrase, where it's sort of, we need systems to be working, within our community. So we need to be working with, and this is where we're lucky as an organization to have a social work team. So they are getting in there, they're engaging with, not only clients and their pets, but also with things across the city. So we do sort of pop-up clinics to get to encampments or human shelters and do vaccine clinics and other things like that. We also are trying to work with different shelters to become co-housed so that they feel comfortable having pets and people in the same pace. And how do you manage that safely with different species and different layouts and setups? So I think it's just recognizing, or obviously the food bank world, how do you incorporate human food bank access as well as pet pantry sort of like methodologies together? So it's learning on how the human social services have run and how can we make sure that we are mindful of each other and how our systems interact, and that it's sort of this really multi-pronged approach that we need to be looking at.
It does seem like there's that, like you said, that intersection that all of a sudden these industries kind of have been operating in parallel to each other for many decades. And now we're realizing there's a lot more commonality, and the challenges that people have affect the animals and vice versa. And as you said earlier, the very last thing parents of an animal want to do is get rid of the animal. And so it's the hardest thing for them to have to say, I can no longer afford, because oftentimes they don't know that these programs exist and these other resources. And so it's, as you said, all these things are kind of intertwined now when it seems like it was very separate a decade ago.
Yeah. And it's funny for us at Toronto Humane Society because we actually started working along with children and animals was sort of how we started. And then it sort of branched out to separate sort of focus is. And then it's funny to see now that obviously more than just children, but just in general, that sort of like coming back full circle for us, where it's like, oh, we really should have never separated. And if we had stayed together, maybe we could have bought a lot of time here, where
Sure.
we recognize that sort of like fundamentally, being there for people that are vulnerable or marginalized and need those support systems in place. How are we going to make sure that we service them? With, I think it comes to also recognizing that shift in how pets are part of the family or how they're perceived, and that sort of significance that we know the human animal bond has. So all the benefits it has to the person as much as it does to the pet. And that the sort of traditional ideas that there are certain people that don't deserve a pet because of whatever circumstances they find themselves in, or knowing that people will not leave IPV because of their pets or children. Like, we have systems in place to address the children or try to address the children aspect. And we're now getting into the animal side, where it's like, how can we make sure that there are those safety nets for people that, are experiencing some sort of crisis or challenge, and without demoralizing that, like, they deserve that pet, they love and care for that pet, and they are willing to do, we've had people who have come to us where they've been living in their car for as long as possible, but then the weather changes and they can't anymore. So then they've tried these other options and they just can't. So it's sort of those things where that, I think that shift in like, oh, people actually care, and we know that bond is important and beneficial to both sides. So breaking that does not make sense. And I think our shelter model that we're sort of running on our side of admit it, care for it, rehome it, works when that doesn't exist. But we know that a good portion of people that come to us, especially from the medical side or being unhoused or requiring some other social service support, there are ways that we can help that without it resulting in relinquishment.
Yeah, I love all that. I mean, it's a positive approach to this. And it's just, you can't connect the dots looking forward, right? So it's like, sometimes you just got to pivot and try things, and like you're doing. And it feels to me like your journey, and having learned so much, having done practically every job in the shelter at this point, really helps you, and your background in social work helps you to kind of look at this problem differently than we've looked at in the past. But I'm curious, Melissa. I mean, if I had a time machine and you could go back to your younger self when you were getting into this, what advice would you give her?
I would say, I think there's a lot of imposter syndrome in the industry everywhere, but I feel like in animal welfare, there's a lot of that. And there's a lot of, feeling insecure or not confident in sort of what you're recommending or what programs or decisions you think are in the best interest of, whether that's a particular animal in front of you, a family in front of you, organizational strategy, like feeling confident to know that you're bringing something to the table and that your opinion or observations matter. Obviously, there's like time and places and appropriate way to like communicate those things. But I think trying to tackle that imposter syndrome, I mean, it still exists, but a little bit earlier, and just sort of understanding that, if you can understand, what I found really helpful for me was when I was able to shift from the not just thinking of each individual animal. So I was always sort of focused on that tree, and stepping back to sort of look at the forest and see, how does, this animal play into the whole ecosystem of the shelter, and what is in that animal's best interest and all overall animal flow. Like, taking those approaches took me many years, even a few years into Toronto Humane Society, before I was able to sort of move and sort of split my brain into a like subjective, loving, caring side of the individual animal and families in front of me against the sort of objective and more reality-based things that have to happen. So those would be my things, like feeling more confident in what I know and what I could bring earlier on, but then also knowing that like there are going to be hard decisions that have to be made, and making sure that as you're making them, you're not losing yourself or your care or drive to it, and just recognizing that like, how does that fit into the sort of whole mission.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that's sound advice. It sounds like you've learned so much along the way, and you've pivoted and you tried different things. And as you said, now in the role that you're in, you're actually able to step back a little bit and look at the forest through the trees and look at things more in aggregate, pay attention to the trends, see what other organizations are doing. I mean, I've said from my perspective, my opinion, unless medically or behaviorally necessary, every animal should be in a foster home. They shouldn't be in the shelter, right? We know they're healthier, they're more socialized, they're more likely to get adopted because they got somebody advocating like all the reasons. But it's hard. I acknowledge and admit, I mean, it's not an easy thing to just snap your fingers, but if we could continue to focus on our foster programs and grow those, I see a day when that becomes a reality, and then the shelters become more of a resource center where it still exists. The shelter needs to exist, but as you kind of talked about, the kind of the purpose and the focus pivots to support the needs of the community. So Melissa, as we start to get closer to the end here, I'd like to wrap up with a lightning round with a whole bunch of questions where we can learn a little bit of fun stuff about you. Okay?
All right.
All right. Right. So the first one's a tough one, right? You got to pick one: kitten purrs or puppy breath?
Kitten purrs.
Kitten purrs. Nothing like a good kitten purr. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you an early bird or late night owl?
Oh, both. Run on a little sleep. But I would say for work, has to be early. But if I had my choice, I would be a night owl.
Okay, that makes sense. I like that. If you had to describe your team in one word, what word would you choose?
I want to say like enthusiastic.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
That's
trying to encapsulate like where we're on the brink of something. And I think there's a lot of drive and sort of girth behind that.
I like that. What's one ingredient you think just doesn't belong on a pizza?
I know, I feel like this debate is usually like anchovies or pineapple or something like that. But I'm someone who's just like always just a basic cheese. So it feels like for me, everything like,
doesn't belong.
Yeah, I just want the cheese and sauce. But I do actually like a pineapple when it's on there. Or I hate cilantro. I don't know if that ever ends up on a pizza, but I'm one of those that like it tastes like soap to me. So
right. One of those people that doesn't. There's like an enzyme or something. I have cilantro, but I totally get it. Totally makes sense. If your pet was writing a Yelp review about you as a pet parent, how many stars do you think you'd get?
That's funny. I mean, I want to say 5, but I'm sure there's times where they would probably say that I, because I have to leave and go to work, or I don't do everything. Maybe the lab would like food exactly at 5 o'clock, and sometimes things don't happen at that time. So he may dock me some points there. Or my cat, I would love to cuddle, and sometimes she does not. So I would say I would hopefully land at like a 4.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds fair. I think the three of them would get together, right? And they'd kind of have confidence and say, yeah, she's definitely not perfect, but, she's better than average. So
yeah, I would hope.
I like that. If you could give an award to anybody from your life, past or present, who would it be?
I had a colleague who had passed away a few years ago, and she was just incredible. And I wish there was more time with her and we could have done more, because she would have been she was like my right hand man. And so I wish there was a way that I could go back and really make sure she knew how valuable she was, and the like amazing work that she did in her time with us, and how much she could have done if she was able to be here longer. So I think there's some way to give an award to her.
I love that. That's a great story. And my final question, Melissa, is what do you want your legacy to be?
That's not rapid. That's a hard one. So, I mean, I think there's so many like levels. Like, I do feel like, being where I am with Toronto Humane Society on sort of the changes that we're making as an organization is going to have real impact. So that's not necessarily like how Melissa Shupak is going to be remembered, but I think as the organization and sort of like, through the current strategic plan and then moving forward, like how the organization is making shifts, just to be a part of that sort of like machine is great. For me as an individual, I think, if there's just at least one team member who moves through and just can remember something that I had said that made them feel like there was value in either them as a member of animal welfare or something that got them into the direction that we're trying to go and sort of got them bought in. I think that those are the sort of like macro, micro levels of sort of just like that I would sort of look at it.
I love that. Melissa, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed talking to you and hearing your stories. And I think you bring such an interesting perspective with that background and social welfare, obviously now into animal welfare. And I've really just enjoyed talking to you today. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks so much for having me. It was so nice.